February 8, 1904. The port of Lushuan, which the Russians called Port Arthur, sits quiet under a winter sky. Ashore, officers are celebrating a birthday, champagne, a band playing somewhere in the officers' quarters. The Imperial Russian Pacific Fleet rides at anchor, confident that nothing out here in the Far East could possibly threaten it. Why would it? In St. Petersburg, the talk among the Tsar's ministers is dismissive at best. The Japanese are a curiosity, a nation of farmers and fishermen who've been playing dress-up as a modern power for a few decades. One of the Tsar's own cousins goes so far as to use a racial slur for them in official correspondence, not even bothering to hide his contempt. That confidence is about to get several thousand men killed. Out in the dark water, without any declaration of war, Japanese torpedo boats are already closing in. By morning, 3 Russian warships are crippled, and an empire that liked to think of itself as the policeman of Asia has just taken a punch it never saw coming, from a country it never bothered to respect. Most people outside of history classrooms have never heard of the Russo-Japanese War. There's no monument to it in the average American town, no film trilogy, no place in the popular memory the way the world wars occupy. But every general staff in Europe studied this war closely, because 10 years before the trenches of 1914, before the machine gun nests and the failed cavalry charges into modern firepower, all of it had already happened once, in Manchuria, and almost nobody paid attention. This is how the 20th century found out what war was about to become. To understand why 2 nations fought over a stretch of frozen coastline neither one's population could locate on a map, you need some sense of the era. This was the age of empire, Britain, France, Germany, even the United States, all operating on the same basic assumption, that greatness was measured in colonies, coaling stations, and flags planted on someone else's land. Russia wanted its piece of that too, and its eyes had settled on the Far East. On paper, the Russian Empire under Tsar Nicholas II looked unstoppable. It was the largest country on the planet, stretching from Poland to the Pacific. Underneath that size, though, was a government that hadn't modernized nearly as fast as it needed to. Industry lagged behind Western Europe. Railways were sparse for a country this vast. The political system was an autocracy trying to hold on in a century that was rapidly losing patience with autocracies. And the army, however enormous on paper, hadn't fought a serious modern war in decades. What Russia lacked in readiness, it made up for in appetite. For years the court had wanted a warm water port somewhere in the Pacific. Vladivostok froze every winter, which made it useless as a year-round naval base. In 1898, Russia got what it wanted. Leaning on a weakened China, it secured a lease on Port Arthur and the Liaodong Peninsula, and quickly began fortifying the place. Russian troops moved into Manchuria, officially to guard a railway line Russia was building through Chinese territory, unofficially, to extend Russian control over the whole region. Now look at the other side of that water, because Japan's story runs almost in the opposite direction. 50 years before any of this, Japan had been a closed, feudal country, samurai and shoguns, no real navy, barely any industry to speak of. Then in 1853, an American commodore named Matthew Perry sailed a squadron of steam-powered warships into Tokyo Bay and forced the country open, essentially at gunpoint. It was a humiliation the Japanese didn't forget, and the response to it reshaped the entire nation. Within a single generation, Japan pulled off something almost no other non-Western country managed at the time. It modernized on its own terms, sent students abroad, hired foreign advisors, built shipyards and railways, raised a conscript army modeled on Germany's and a navy modeled on Britain's. By the 1890s, Japan wasn't play-acting anymore. It was armed, disciplined, and it wanted the rest of the world to notice. In 1894, it got its chance to prove that. Japan went to war with China over control of Korea and won, decisively, a real shock to a world that had assumed Asian nations simply couldn't beat European-style militaries. The peace deal handed Japan Taiwan and a foothold on the Liaodong Peninsula, the same territory Russia would later grab for itself. Here's the part that matters, though: Russia, along with Germany and France, forced Japan to give that peninsula back to China, in the name of regional stability. Japan, not yet strong enough to say no to three powers at once, backed down. 3 years later, Russia turned around and leased that exact same territory for itself. Sit with that for a second. Japan wins a war fair and square. Europe tells them they can't keep what they earned, supposedly for the greater good. And then one of the very powers that lectured them walks in and takes the prize instead. That's not a diplomatic disagreement. That's the same humiliation twice, from the same hand. Japan didn't forget it. And Japan had no intention of sitting through a third one. Korea became the flashpoint for everything that followed. Both empires wanted influence there, Russia because it bordered Russian territory and offered another possible warm water outlet, Japan because Japanese strategists genuinely believed a hostile power controlling Korea would be, in their words, a dagger pointed at Japan's heart. Tokyo made a fairly reasonable offer more than once. Japan would accept Russian dominance in Manchuria if Russia accepted Japanese dominance in Korea. It wasn't an unreasonable ask, coming from the weaker side. St. Petersburg mostly ignored it. There were ministers who took Japan seriously, but the louder voices in the Tsar's inner circle treated the whole thing as a nuisance rather than a genuine threat, a country that would fold the moment Russia flexed, the same way it had in 1895. Nicholas himself thought a short, victorious war might actually do Russia some good, both for national pride and as a convenient distraction from growing unrest at home over political reform. That single assumption, that Japan simply wouldn't dare fight a European empire, turned out to be the hinge the entire war swung on. While Russia underestimated its rival, Japan was busy preparing. In 1902, Tokyo secured an alliance with Britain, which meant that if any third power joined Russia in a war against Japan, Britain would step in on Japan's side. That single agreement removed Japan's worst-case scenario, facing a coalition instead of Russia alone. Japan also bought modern battleships from British shipyards, some of the best in the world at the time, and drilled its forces relentlessly. By the end of 1903, talks between Tokyo and St. Petersburg had effectively broken down. Japan sent a final proposal in December. Russia's response was slow, partly from bureaucratic dysfunction, partly because too many people in charge simply didn't believe Japan would actually go through with a war. On February 6, 1904, Japan cut off diplomatic relations. 2 days later, without any formal declaration, Japanese torpedo boats hit the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. The war nobody in St. Petersburg believed would happen had just started. The opening attack on Port Arthur wasn't a knockout blow, and it didn't need to be. All it had to do was seize the initiative before Russia's sheer size could come into play, and at that, it worked. 3 Russian warships were damaged in the torpedo strikes, including 2 of the fleet's most powerful battleships. None of them sank outright, but all 3 were out of action for weeks, at exactly the moment Russia needed its navy intact. The next day, Admiral Togo Hihikaro's fleet engaged the remaining Russian ships in a bombardment that didn't settle much on its own. It didn't have to. Japan had already accomplished the thing that mattered most in the opening days of this kind of war. It had crippled its opponent's ability to contest the water. Here's why that mattered so much. Russia's real strength, its manpower, its industry, its reserves, sat thousands of miles away, connected to the Far East by a single, unfinished rail line. Parts of the Trans-Siberian Railway were so incomplete that trains had to be ferried across a frozen lake, or unloaded and marched around the gaps by hand. Getting reinforcements from European Russia to Manchuria wasn't a matter of weeks. It was months. Japan had the opposite problem, or rather, the opposite advantage. It was fighting close to home, and as long as its navy controlled the surrounding seas, every soldier, every shell, every horse it needed could cross in a matter of days. That's the real purpose behind the strike at Port Arthur. It was never really about sinking Russia's fleet outright. It was about pinning that fleet down, bottling it up in harbor, and buying Japan the one resource its rival had in abundance and it didn't: time. For the following months, the Russian Pacific Fleet stayed mostly trapped inside Port Arthur's harbor, harassed repeatedly by Japanese attempts to block the entrance by scuttling old ships in the channel. Meanwhile, Japanese troops began landing in Korea and moving north, completely unopposed at sea. The rest of the world was watching, and the reaction was closer to disbelief than anything else. European newspapers, which had spent decades treating Japan as a novelty at best, suddenly had to explain how an Asian navy had just outmaneuvered a European power in the opening days of a war. Assumptions about Western military superiority that had gone unquestioned for a century were, for the first time, publicly cracking. Naval skirmishes don't win wars by themselves, though. Armies do. And by spring, the real land campaign was getting underway. In late April 1904, Japanese forces crossed the Yalu River, the border between Korea and Manchuria, and handed Russian defenders a sharp defeat. It was the first time in the modern era that an Asian army had beaten a European army in a straightforward, open land battle, and the shock of it rippled through capitals well beyond Tokyo and St. Petersburg. From there, Japan's armies pushed steadily into Manchuria, aiming at two targets, the rail hub of Liaoyang, and the fortress at Port Arthur itself, which Japan needed to knock out permanently as a naval base. What's striking about the fighting that followed is how little it resembled the wars that came before it, and how much it resembled the war that was still a decade away. Both sides dug trenches. Both strung barbed wire. Both brought machine guns and rapid-fire artillery in numbers no previous war had ever seen. Men who charged forward in the old tight formations, the way armies had fought for generations, got cut down by weapons that simply hadn't existed the last time Russia, or most of Europe, had fought a major war. Foreign military observers, from Britain, Germany, France, and the United States, attached themselves to both sides specifically to study these new tactics. Quite a few of them came away deeply unsettled. Almost none of what they wrote actually changed anything back home. At Liaoyang, in late August 1904, roughly 200,000 troops on each side collided in one of the largest battles the world had seen up to that point. It dragged on for over a week. Japan eventually took the city, but the cost was brutal, and that pattern, victory bought at horrifying expense, would repeat itself again and again. Japanese commanders, operating under a rigid doctrine that prized aggression above almost everything else, kept ordering infantry straight at fortified positions and modern firepower, accepting losses that would have made most European commanders think twice. This is worth pausing on, because it's one of the more overlooked lessons of the entire war. Japan won. But Japan very nearly bled itself out doing it. The casualty numbers at Liaoyang, and later at Port Arthur, should have told every general staff in Europe something crucial: modern firepower had permanently changed what a frontal assault cost in human lives. Some of the foreign observers said exactly that in their reports. Almost nobody in Berlin, Paris, London, or Vienna acted on it. A decade later, their own armies relearned the same lesson, at a far higher price, in the mud along the Western Front. If any single campaign captures both the horror and the modernity of this war, it's the Siege of Port Arthur. General Nogi Mersuk got the grim job of taking the fortress by land, since the navy alone couldn't dislodge the Russian fleet still sheltering inside the harbor. What followed, from around June 1904 into January 1905, was one of the bloodiest sieges of the era, a grinding fight over a handful of hills and forts that Japanese soldiers would remember with dread for the rest of their lives. The worst of them was a rise called 203-meter Hill. Port Arthur was ringed with concrete fortifications, barbed wire, minefields, searchlights, and machine gun nests, a genuine preview of the kind of defensive warfare that would define an entire generation of European fighting a decade later. Japanese infantry threw themselves at these positions wave after wave, taking casualties that shocked even the hardened observers watching from the sidelines. At 203-meter Hill alone, fighting for the high ground that would let Japanese artillery spotters see straight into the harbor, Japan lost tens of thousands of men. General Nogi's own two sons died in this campaign. He kept fighting anyway. That single detail tells you almost everything you need to know about the sense of duty driving the Japanese military at the time, a code that decades later would curdle into something far darker, but that in 1904 was watched by much of the world with a strange mix of unease and respect. When 203-meter hill finally fell in December, Japanese artillery could now see directly into the harbor, and heavy siege guns began methodically destroying the trapped Russian fleet, ship by ship, where it sat helpless. Calling it a naval battle would be generous. It was closer to an execution. On January 2, 1905, the Russian commander surrendered Port Arthur. The siege had cost roughly 60,000 Japanese casualties, and tens of thousands more on the Russian side, over a single fortress town. In miniature, it was a preview of Verdun. With Port Arthur out of the picture, Japan turned its attention to the main Russian field army, which had regrouped near the city of Mukden. What followed, in February and March of 1905, was, at the time, the largest land battle in recorded history, a record it would only hold until the First World War made it look modest by comparison. Nearly 500,000 men fought along a front stretching more than 50 miles. Though outnumbered, Japanese forces attempted a wide flanking maneuver aimed at enveloping the entire Russian army. The fighting stretched on for close to 3 weeks in brutal late winter conditions. In the end, the Russian commander, worried about being surrounded, ordered a general withdrawal, narrowly saving his army from total destruction, but abandoning Mukden and losing roughly 90,000 men in the process. Japan's own losses weren't far behind, at around 70,000. Mukden effectively ended large-scale land fighting for the war. Japan held the field, but its army and its treasury were both running on fumes. What almost nobody outside Tokyo's inner circle understood at the time was just how close to the edge Japan actually was. The country was nearly bankrupt from the cost of the war, and its army had absorbed losses severe enough that another campaign on this scale simply wasn't realistic. Russia, meanwhile, still held the one advantage no single battle could take away: sheer numbers, and a homeland the fighting had never touched. Given enough time, Russia's reserves would eventually tip the balance. Which is exactly why what happened next, at sea, ended up mattering so much. With the Pacific Fleet gone, Tsar Nicholas made a call that, in hindsight, borders on tragic. He ordered Russia's Baltic Fleet, renamed the Second Pacific Squadron, to sail halfway around the globe and relieve Port Arthur. On May 27 and 28, 1905, in the strait between Korea and Japan, the two fleets finally met, and what followed stands today as one of the most lopsided naval battles in history. Togo had drilled his fleet relentlessly for this exact moment. His ships were faster, better maintained, and crewed by men who were rested and combat-tested. As the Russian fleet steamed into the strait, Togo pulled off a maneuver still studied in naval academies, crossing the head of the Russian line, a risky move that briefly exposed his own ships to concentrated fire, but let him bring his full broadside to bear on the lead Russian ships, one after another. It wasn't really a battle anymore at that point. It was a slaughter. Of roughly 38 ships in the Russian fleet, the vast majority ended up sunk, captured, or forced to intern in neutral ports. Nearly every Russian battleship, the ships that had just sailed 18,000 miles to get here, was destroyed or captured, along with thousands of sailors killed and thousands more taken prisoner, including Rozhestvensky himself, wounded and captured aboard his own flagship. Japan lost a handful of small torpedo boats. That's it. It's hard to overstate what Tsushima meant to the world at the time. A major European naval power had just been essentially wiped out in a single engagement, by a nation that 50 years earlier hadn't owned a single modern warship. For the first time, the assumption of automatic Western military superiority had cracked in full public view, on the biggest possible stage, and that shockwave reached places its architects in Tokyo never fully anticipated, feeding independence movements across colonized Asia and beyond. For Russia, this was the blow there was no coming back from. St. Petersburg, already dealing with revolutionary unrest at home that would become known as the Revolution of 1905, had no appetite left for continuing the fight. There's an American thread running through the end of this story that most people don't expect. Despite its string of battlefield wins, Japan was in no shape to keep fighting. Its treasury was nearly empty, and its army had been bled dry at Port Arthur and Mukden. Tokyo needed peace almost as badly as St. Petersburg did, it just couldn't afford to let the world know it. President Theodore Roosevelt saw the opening and took it. He'd followed the war closely, admired Japan's discipline, and understood that a negotiated peace served American interests in the Pacific better than a fight to total exhaustion on either side. In the summer of 1905, at his invitation, delegations from both empires traveled to the United States and sat down at the negotiating table in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The talks were tense. Japan's delegates, representing a country that had won every major battle, wanted a substantial financial indemnity and territory befitting a decisive victor. Russia's delegates, representing a country that had lost every major battle but still commanded the world's largest army and hadn't been invaded on its own soil, refused to pay a single ruble and held their ground. Roosevelt worked both sides personally, hosting delegates aboard his own yacht, shuttling proposals back and forth, applying pressure where he could. In September 1905, the two sides signed the Treaty of Portsmouth. Japan got recognition of its dominant position in Korea, control of southern Sakhalin Island, and the lease on the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, the very fortress so many had died to take. Russia paid nothing. For brokering the peace, Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, the first American to receive one. It's one of the more significant and, today, more overlooked moments in American diplomatic history, a sitting president personally ending a war between two foreign empires, on American soil, less than a decade before the United States would be pulled into a world war of its own. Back in Japan, the peace terms sparked outrage. The public, fed a steady diet of victory reports for over a year, had no idea how close their own war effort had come to collapse, and felt cheated by a treaty that secured no indemnity after so much sacrifice. Riots broke out in Tokyo. There's a bitter irony in that, the victors, furious at a peace their own government knew was the best deal realistically on the table. So what did this war actually change? For Russia, the damage went well beyond the battlefield. Humiliation abroad fed straight into unrest at home. The revolution of 1905, with its strikes, mutinies, and the massacre remembered as Bloody Sunday, forced the Tsar to grant Russia's first elected parliament, a concession he despised and spent the next decade trying to claw back. The government that emerged from that crisis was weaker and far less trusted by its own people than it had been in generations. A lot of historians argue the seeds of 1917 were planted right here, on the hills of Manchuria and in the waters off Tsushima. For Japan, the win confirmed its arrival as a great power, the first non-Western nation to defeat a European empire in the modern era. But there was something corrosive baked into that triumph. The lesson Japan's leadership took away wasn't caution, it was confidence, a growing sense of military destiny in Asia that, over the following decades, hardened into the aggressive expansion that eventually pulled Japan into the Second World War. And for the rest of the world, the warning signs were sitting right out in the open. Modern rifles and machine guns had turned the old-fashioned frontal assault into a form of mass suicide. Trenches and barbed wire could grind even the most determined offensive to a halt. Wars between industrialized nations weren't going to be short, decisive affairs anymore. They were going to be long, grinding, and catastrophically costly in human lives. Nearly every major army in Europe had officers embedded with both sides during this war, writing detailed reports. Some of those reports got things right. Almost all of them were filed away and forgotten, because it was simply more comfortable to assume European wars would somehow play out differently. They didn't. 9 years after Portsmouth, the armies of Europe marched off to war carrying the exact same illusions this conflict should have already killed: a short campaign, a glorious offensive, home again by Christmas. Instead they found the trenches and the casualty lists that Manchuria had already shown anyone willing to pay attention. The Russo-Japanese War wasn't a world war. But it was the dress rehearsal for one, and the world simply didn't learn its lines in time. Two empires went to war in 1904 over a stretch of coastline most of their own citizens couldn't have pointed to on a map. One came out victorious and walked straight into a darker chapter of its own making. The other came out broken and stumbled into a revolution that would reshape the century. And the rest of the world got a preview, written in blood on the hills above Port Arthur and in the waters off Tsushima, of exactly what modern war was about to become. 9 years later, almost nobody remembered the lesson.